Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. As you know, we are currently overcoming extreme censorship, so sharing episodes far and wide is incredibly helpful. If you want to go to mattbelair.com and become a member by donation or for free, you can get all the episodes there as well. And most importantly, consider doing three kind acts wherever you are in the world today. Today's guest is an international speaker and the author of An End to Upside Down Thinking, which was awarded the IPPY Best Science Book of 2019. He is also the author of An End to Upside Down Living and An End to Upside Down Liberty, and is the host of the podcast, Where is My Mind? He currently sits on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the School of Wholeness and Enlightenment. He graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University. Welcome back to the show, Mark Gober.
Matt, thank you for having me back.
Man, it's so good to see you. I get an email from maybe your agent or whatever the heck you got going on over there, and I see you've written a new book, which I'm like, yes, this is a great title. Stoked to talk about this. And then there was a book sandwich in between that I didn't know about. So, it was awesome having you on the show. I think maybe 3 years ago, and you're doing great work, and doing the podcast and all that kind of thing, and putting out 2 books in between and doing a lot of stuff. It's just great to catch up. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your journey, and we'll dive into, some of the awesome stuff you're putting out there.
Okay. Well, my background on the surface has nothing to do with what I've been writing and speaking about for the last few years. As you mentioned, I went to Princeton, and like a lot of my classmates, I went into investment banking. A lot of people go into either investment banking or strategy consulting. It's a big feeder into those areas, among other places. But I said, okay, I'm going to do the investment banking route. And I graduated in 2008. So that meant I was in investment banking during the financial crisis. A really tough time to be there. Barely slept. I didn't enjoy the work itself, but it was like the next thing to do. So I did it. But I was looking for what I was going to do next. I knew it wasn't a long-term career path. So I ended up going to something that was a little bit similar to investment banking, but a little more out there and sounded interesting. And I joined a firm in 2010 where I spent 10 years, became a partner there, called Sherpa Technology Group, where I was advising technology companies in basically every sector, but focusing on their intellectual property. So I got to look at inventions across all kinds of different industries. Pretty interesting work. And then also look at the legal strategy behind that, the business strategy. And that was my world. I was really focused on doing deals, and we were helping companies do their strategy, but also buy and sell assets. So it was all consuming as well. But in 2016, things shifted for me in a big way. And I talk about this more in my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, when I talk about my personal journey. But even leading up to that, there was a lot of like personal dissatisfaction, where let's say a deal didn't go my way and I was super upset about it, or just like in dating or something. And I didn't know how to like think about successes and failures in life because I thought life was meaningless. I had this very nihilistic, materialistic worldview that there's no meaning to the universe. We're here, we exist because of a random biological process of billions of years of the universe, of atoms colliding. I happen to be here, and my consciousness, my awareness comes from my brain. And then when my body dies, that's the end. And I wouldn't have said it all that way.
It's so depressing.
Yeah. But Matt, that's actually the worldview I was taught, even though they wouldn't describe it that way. Like that's the way a lot of the people around me think and used to think. So I would go through life, and like I was so achievement focused in everything I did. I was a competitive athlete, tennis player in college, and even before that. So I was always focused on achieving the next thing, and I would achieve them at some point, and then I was like on a treadmill where it didn't matter 5 minutes later. So I guess I got to a point where I realized I was on a treadmill and didn't know what to do about it. And my conclusion at the time was, well, this is just the world we live in, and it's a random universe. So Mark, you just have to deal with it. I wasn't looking for another answer, but I ended up finding one. So I don't know if that was the universe finding me somehow. I don't know how it happened. But what happened was I was listening to podcasts in 2016, because that was when they started to get a little bit bigger. And mostly they were on business and health topics. I was listening to one on alternative health called Extreme Health Radio. And they interviewed a woman named Laura Powers. And it was just the next show in the queue. It wasn't like I was looking for this episode. And she started talking about how she had psychic abilities and left her career in higher education and like had a politics master's or something. So she sounded pretty normal and was talking about using psychic abilities and working with energy and like pretty out there stuff. And they had a conversation for, I guess it was over an hour. I listened to the whole thing. And it wasn't like my worldview shifted and I said, oh my goodness, there's this other reality. It was just kind of like, oh, that's an interesting topic. I would like to learn more about that. So I ended up listening to Laura's podcast called Healing Powers. And over the course of maybe 3 weeks in August, September of 2016, I listened to all of her episodes from 2016 back to 2011. And I was driving from San Francisco down to Silicon Valley, lots of traffic. So I had podcast time. And I realized at that point, because I heard so many different voices describe a similar picture of reality that I was not accustomed to, something hit me. I was like, oh no, I need to figure this out, because if there's any reality to what they're saying, then everything I thought was true is not true. And that's where it started for me, because then I wanted to research. So I was working and it was such a disorienting period for me because I was lost in life. I wasn't sure career-wise what I wanted to do exactly. Like I just didn't know where I was headed. And then I was being confronted with this new worldview. And most people around me, if not everyone around me, like friends and family, wouldn't even know how to respond to what I was talking about, like topics like reincarnation and telepathy and tying it to quantum physics. That's the kind of stuff I was doing. So I ended up just continuing to research. And a year later, so the summer of 2017, I said, I'm going to put this down on paper and write a book. So that was my first book, and End Upside Down Thinking. We talked about that in 2018 when it was published. And then produced a podcast series where I interviewed many of the scientists that I wrote about in my first book. So that was in 2019. Again, about these topics like near-death experiences and the continuation of consciousness beyond the body. Then at the end of 2019, after my podcast came out, still at my firm, had become a partner. And I got to the point where I just was I wasn't pulled by the work anymore. So it was a really tough position to be in because I was a partner at the firm. I had lots of responsibilities, not only with my clients, but other people at our company. And I was just, it took too much energy for me to do even basic things at the job. Whereas all I wanted to do was research these stacks of books I have everywhere, and I didn't have enough time for it. And I wanted to listen to more podcasts. So I had a discussion with my business partners and said, look, this is not, I can't do this anymore, which was a very hard thing to do after spending so many years with them. And I was in a great spot professionally. If I had looked back years ago and said, hey, Mark, this is the position you're going to be in your early 30s, I would have thought that was a crazy move to just leave and not have anything lined up for what's next, but it felt like it was the right thing. So I left, went on some extended meditation retreats for the first time ever, those were amazing. And then we started locking down. So my second book came about actually in between two meditation retreats in early 2020 in End Upside Down Living. And I wrote about the spiritual awakening process. So not only just thinking about the science behind consciousness, but how would we then orient our compass for living life? And the question that I ask in the book is, what is the overall intention of your life? And I seek to answer that question for myself based on like building up a view of reality. And then I kept researching. So that came out in 2020, and watching what was happening with the pandemic and seeing a lot of, I'll say, a lack of truth everywhere. It became clear there were lots of other things that I needed to learn. And so I ended up writing a third book at End Upside Down Liberty, which looks at how to optimally organize society. So it's political and economic theory, but also tied to the metaphysical part. And that's where we are today.
Man, what an amazing ride. Well, it sounds like you're the man for the job for, really thinking about our society, using, let's say, the old paradigms, the way that I think naturally, like you talk about your world and how you grew up, and, that paradigm shift would have been huge, right? Saying, oh, shoot, if this is real, I have to rethink everything. And a lot of people on, let's say, my side were, maybe you're more like, I thought about, meditation and spiritual and esoteric, but I'm not naturally as grounded, right? I'm not going to be as logical. I'm not good with numbers. I'm not good with sequence and all that structure. So to bring those two worlds together is, the yin and yang. It's both. And I think that you, and the way that you think things, or think through things and see it and analyze it, because you're not just believing it because someone says it. You're saying, well, how can we, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. How do we prove it? How do we verify it? How do we find out more information? How do we have a conversation about it? How do we listen to people's experiences and really dive in? So I think it's a very powerful framework for, even understanding the scientific method and how we have an ideal life, an ideal society, an ideal way of living, and world views that empower us. And so, you're talking about these frameworks, which which I think are amazing. And you now are on the board of Noetic Sciences, which is very interesting. Dean Radin was on, and I'm blanking on who else was on. He was so far back. He was a part of it as well, doing those random number generator experiments, talking about the noosphere, one of the
Roger
OGs.
Nelson.
That's the one. Yep. So very interesting. And it's how do we bring the science to this unified field or ether? And so do you want to talk a little bit about Noetic Sciences for a minute, and then we'll dive
Yeah,
into a bunch of other stuff?
yeah, absolutely. It was founded in the 1970s, so it's been around for a while. And what drew me to it, well, number one, it's in the Bay Area. So when I was living there, it was an easy ride to the campus. But my first book in particular was a lot about the science of psychic phenomena, the science of the survival of consciousness after the body dies, those kinds of topics. Some people call it non-local consciousness, which is an idea that's completely crazy and outlandish and not even allowed to be discussed in most of the academic world. But there are a few places where you can talk about this stuff. So the University of Virginia has a division of perceptual studies, which has been around since the 60s. And they study children who have past life memories and near-death experiences. So that's one exception to the rule. But otherwise, it's mostly one-off scientists. And there's the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is an independent institute that studies all this stuff in a rigorous way. So Dean Radin is the chief scientist there. And it's just fascinating work. So for me to be involved in getting to see how the science is done and think about how to get the word out to the rest of the world, that's what drew me to it.
That's amazing. And when you talk about your worldview, it seems to me anyway, we're moving more and more, and there's an agenda toward this robotic way of living, right? When you describe that to me, it seems like there is no meaning.
Yeah,
You're not special. You're cogs in a wheel rather than a spiritual being, right? And we look at nature and how that works, and that brings like a presence and a warmth, and also a purpose and a fulfillment. It's like, okay, well, if I'm a spiritual being, what is my purpose here? Right? Everything becomes more important, because that's really where we can really get lost is, I'm meaningless. I'm here to just, suck it up and do whatever society tells me. And there's another fundamental belief in that. It's like, you're kind of creating your life by default, where you're aiming, right? So you go through university, and then you get this investment banking job, right? And you were at the pinnacle, right? I'm an investment banker. I graduated Princeton. I was on a tennis team as a captain, and then you're like, oh crap, this isn't working. Right. Similar to when Jim Carrey or others will say, I wish everyone could be rich and famous, so they could know that that's not the answer. Right. It's not like those perks and the wealth and the freedom that comes with it isn't fantastic. That's going to dry up. Right. If you had all the money and wealth in the world, all the material experiences, eventually you're going to be hollow if you don't have anything of substance to understand who you are. And so maybe you can speak to that a little bit for those people out there who are, or what did you learn in that transition? I think that's so powerful, right? Because some
yeah.
people are really, they want to know what's going on, and they're very analytical. How did you start to find your compass and navigate towards more meaning, and have the ability and strength to let go of that high position that you wanted because something felt off, and you honored that, and so you let it go to go see what the next thing was?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this has really been my journey, what you just asked. And it's on a day-to-day basis, I'm still thinking about that. And what, how am I going to continue going in a direction that's fulfilling and meaningful? Because like you said, I was in a position where logic told me and science told me and the experts told me that life is inherently meaningless. We can create meaning if we want to, but that's just a rationalization because it's temporary. It's temporary meaning. There's nothing like built into the fabric of the universe that says that Matt Belair has a meaningful life. That's the implication if you follow the way they look at the world. So I want to describe that worldview in a little more granularity because it's the basis for a lot of what we'll discuss. And some will call it scientific materialism, others call it physicalism. The basic idea is that the universe is fundamentally made of material stuff. And it's from material stuff, when you have lots of random reactions of pieces of matter and chemical reactions, you end up with biological organisms who develop organs like a brain. And the brain, as they would say, spawns or is what's producing our consciousness. So consciousness it's a tough word to actually define because we can't touch it. It's really abstract. We all experience it, but I can't point to it. So consciousness is our sense of experiencing life. That's a way to think about it. So it's something that anyone listening to this conversation right now has a consciousness that's absorbing this moment. And consciousness is where that's the crux of like everything that I've been exploring, because the materialist view says consciousness comes from the material world, and more specifically, it comes from a brain. And my whole first book and podcast series, it's about dispelling that myth and saying, no, it's the other way around. Consciousness is fundamental, and everything material, all chemistry and biology, they exist, but they exist within consciousness. And that's the upside down thinking. It's not matter to consciousness, it's consciousness to matter. And even Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. That's exactly the idea that we're talking about. So then it gets to your question, well, what are the implications of that? If you believe scientific materialism, that you're just a body temporarily here, and when your brain turns off, it's like you shut off a computer, that's done, no memories anymore, then you can't find real meaning. You can only find temporary meaning. And it's subjective. It's whatever you want it to be at the time. And that can lead to all kinds of problems with morality, for people coming up with their own morality. And if there's nothing compelling people at a more cosmic level to be a good person, that explains a lot of problems we have in the world today. Even though not every single person would be susceptible to that. Like I felt still a compulsion to be a good person. I don't think, if I look back at myself, I wouldn't say that I was a bad person. I still wanted to like be nice to everyone. I wanted to be honest, but I didn't see a greater cosmic purpose behind it. Whereas if we look at this other framework where consciousness is fundamental, the term that I like to use is the one mind, and it's based off of Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning physicist. He said, in truth, there is only one mind. It's such a simple way of saying it, that there's one mind, but using an analogy from Dr. Bernardo Castro, it's like we are whirlpools within a stream. So we have the sense of being individuals, but we're interconnected as part of this one mind. That's the way I think about it. So, okay, well, if I'm a whirlpool within the one mind stream, I'm not just a hunk of matter that's gonna, like a computer that's gonna turn off. Is there something deeper to it? And I mean, a lot of the science, this is why I'm so interested in science behind like telepathy and all these things, because it points to the reality of all this, that consciousness is way beyond our bodies. But in particular, the near-death experience is worth talking about up front, because some of the implications from that are just completely life-changing. So the near-death experience is an instance where a person's brain is either completely off or like barely functioning. And yet the person has this elaborate experience. They come back in their body and they say, what happened? And the doctor says, you're crazy. That's not possible because look, we know what your brain was doing. But in some cases, what they come back, the person will come back upon being resuscitated, and they'll say, no, I saw you from above my body and you were doing X, Y, and Z in the room. And they're like, no, how did you know that? And those cases, they're known as veridical out-of-body experiences, meaning what the person saw is verified as accurate. That's important because it's not a hallucination. By definition, if it's accurate, it's not a hallucination. If it's not a hallucination, that means that there's a highly functioning consciousness at a time when the brain shouldn't be capable of making that kind of cognition. So when I interviewed Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, he said, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. That's exactly what happens. The brain is actually holding back our consciousness in many ways, and it's like a filter. And we liberate it, we see this broader reality. So what do people see in this broader reality? They talk about often being immersed in unconditional love. They sometimes see deceased relatives, or they see mystical beings. And in 20 to 25% of the cases, they have a life review where they relive their whole life in a flash. And not only do they just relive the events, but they see it through the eyes of the people that they impacted. So they get to feel the pain that they inflicted upon someone, or if they brought joy to that person, they get to feel it through that person. So for my podcast, I interviewed Dannion Brinkley, among other people who've had near-death experiences, but he's had 4. And each time he had a life review that he remembers. So he told me about his reliving his combat days in Vietnam and what it was like he said he was vicious in combat, and he felt the deaths of the people that he killed through their eyes. So he felt that pain. And not only that, but he felt the indirect effects. So he felt what it was like to be children who would no longer have fathers because he had killed their fathers in combat. He said it wasn't quite as strong a feeling, but I could tell it was difficult for him to even discuss it because it was just such a painful experience. He had to relive 4 times. But on the flip side, he got to see his own evolution because he had near-death experiences later in life. And when he came back from his early near-death experience, he became a hospice volunteer, became way less materialistic. His whole life changed. So when he, in his later life reviews, he got to see what it was like from the perspective of the dying person in the hospice bed, as Danyan himself was comforting them. So I mentioned all this because this points to real meaning embedded into reality itself. And what Dr. Grayson from UVA has found in interviewing many people who've had these experiences is that it's beyond morality. He says it's a natural law. That's the way it's described. That this reciprocity of basically, we're trying to evolve toward a state of unconditional love, but when that's breached, we experience that ourselves. And so that changes everything in terms of how you would live life, because then priorities shift and values shift. If that's how you think about things, if what really matters is not what kind of job you have, what kind of car you have, if everything is registered within this one mind of consciousness, and what seems to matter is how much joy can we bring to people, how unconditionally loving can we be as an aspiration, then that changes everything.
Mark, that was friggin' phenomenal, man. I loved every bit of how you worded that and the experiences. You know, there's so much that you brought up when you were sharing that, you know, the work of Dawson Church from Mind to Matter. And this for me, coming from a martial arts perspective of creating reality, and even you would have a sense of this from being an athlete, of knowing like what you want to do with the ball and how you are creating that. So then all of a sudden you have this little seed that knows, well, my consciousness does affect how I play and how I'm operating here. And so I think sport is a really great gateway to kind of see how we influence reality through our consciousness. And I really love the end of beyond morality into natural law. And that makes me kind of think about, you know, this free will universe we're in, and why this is so meaningful. And if there indeed is an agenda to make us think these things, because I have heard of, you know, one of my backgrounds, people who listen to the podcast know this, is I didn't know why we had war and starvation. So I started to look into that. It didn't make any sense. It went away everything that I understood and felt as a human. Why are we having mass war? Why are we having mass starvation? Why are there these horrific things going on when that's the last thing that I want to do or experience or promote? And you learn about these ideologies and people and worldviews that think differently. You know, I've heard of worldviews before that they think if you take away all morality, then you can do anything you want to a man or a woman. Right. And I've heard, like, you know, in interviews with people like Rockefeller and a few other people, you know, kind of just say these things and, you know, see people as, you know, lesser than or moving the morality. And that's kind of like the spirit. And also going into the weird stuff, I've been aware that these people want to remove the ghost in the machine, remove the spirit, so we become more like a robot. So through education, through worldview, through medication, and even Rudolf Steiner said in early 1900s, they will produce a vaccine that will drive out the spirit of all men. How would he know that in the 1900s or understand that agenda if they weren't speaking about it, right? And so why would people do this? And, you know, but Alex Sakaris wrote a book, Why Evil Matters, How Science and Religion Flubbed a Big One. And that's a hard understanding for a good person to understand why people would architect this worldview. And that's where, you know, on the flip side of that, when we have free will and you talk about beyond morality into natural law, and when your consciousness, you know, which is limited, right? And that's such a great way to frame it, because you know, I can only operate this Zoom chatting with you, maybe drinking this water and listening to you at the same time, right? I can't do that much at once with my consciousness, drive my car, maybe have some random thoughts. So it's really narrowed. But when you go into meditation or you have an out of body experience or you have something greater, you realize that there is this infinite energy, consciousness, and connection, and you're a part of that. And Alan Watts will say, like a drop in the ocean, right? And I love that analogy. It's like you are the entire ocean, but the drop separates. Like, oh, okay. So with that understanding, I'm basically saying the same thing you said, but with that understanding, then it becomes a spiritual universe.
Yeah.
Then what you do matters. Then not only are you choosing in this mystery, and I think it has to be a mystery, otherwise we don't have that free will choice to do the right thing, the moral thing, to honor that gut or inside voice that we have that knows between right and wrong, and make that choice versus, oh, I'm going to ignore that because none of this matters. Do you want to comment on that? That's kind of how
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I think about it too. And there's also the notion of karma, which is kind of, we're both alluding to it in many ways, but I think that's a really important way of thinking about just like prioritizing what we do and making decisions. And the idea of karma in a simplistic sense is that there are consequences to our actions, that there's some kind of a balancing force in the universe. Although I'm somewhat hesitant to even talk about karma because it's probably so complex that we, in a conversation, won't even get close to understanding what it actually is. But this general idea that there is intelligence in the universe, what we do matters, then it's just going to influence how we make each decision in our lives, both from the perspective of wanting to help other people because we're all interconnected, and at some level, we are all the same. So in my second book, I use this term, the absolute perspective versus the relative perspective. The absolute perspective being the one stream, the one mind, where we are literally the same. There's no distinction. But we don't operate at that level when we are having this conscious conversation. We operate at the relative, where it seems like we're separate. And the paradox is that they coexist. These things exist at the same time. And appreciating that those paradoxes exist in the universe, I think, is super important, because it's easy to get caught in an either or mentality and not understand that there could be things happening that seem to contradict each other, but actually don't contradict each other at a different lens.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's like that image they show sometimes where they go, "This is a square, this is a circle, and then this is the truth," and it just kind of shows the shadows
Yeah.
on how, from one perspective, with more information, the paradox gets resolved, where there
Yeah.
can be two truths, and that's, again, being in this mystery and having a little bit of faith. And the karma idea is interesting, and with everything that's going on in the world, and we discussed this a little bit at the beginning, it seems often that what we're taught is incorrect. And I really went down the rabbit holes of spirituality and these spiritual teachings and say, okay, which one's the right one? Right? Which is the right God, which is the right faith, which is the right way to live, which is the most spiritual on the spiritual scoreboard. And going to the Parliament of World Religions and seeing over 200 religions or philosophies or frameworks represented. And so, whether it's like our material reality, and all the things that go with it, and what's going on here and what's possible, or the metaphysical reality, we don't know that much. And I've kind of come right now, I'm sure there's more. If you think of one, let me know. But we know what we can do. So I was like, okay, we know, if I know I can, do a kickflip on my skateboard, I can do that, or make a sandwich, I can do that. I know that, so I know what I can do. But other than that, the only thing I really know is my intent. And I feel like that can maybe go into the karma, because if from that higher view, my intent was good and it caused harm, and when I realized that, my intent was to resolve that or help it if I had the opportunity, from that higher picture, maybe the universe at play is helping something out that like you didn't do. But if you're going around and you have either malice intent, or you're kind of a atheist where nothing matters, right? Maybe you're causing harm through ignorance or ignorance, because you
Yeah.
don't want to connect to that thing. And so from that intent, I feel like that's where it would make sense to me our karma would be linked. What do you think of
Yeah.
that?
That's how I think about it too. Of course, not knowing exactly how the universe works, my understanding is that the way we are,
Not yet,
are
not yet. Anyway, not
I
with
don't
your
know.
brain. Noetic, soon to come, next book.
I haven't gotten there yet, but I think about it the same way, Matt, in my own life. Is like, what's my intention behind this? But I reverse engineer my intention of like, why am I doing this really? What's behind that? And my understanding is that, especially in life reviews, all that stuff is picked up, like true intentions, and there's an all-knowing field of intelligence that we're a part of. But one of the other paradoxes that's built into what we're just discussing is this idea of we're the collective. We are literally the collective at one level, but at another level, we're individuals. And so when we set our intentions, it's important to recognize that we're both, and that to ignore yourself as an individual is I think, a spiritual problem, because you're part of the whole stream. You're part of the one mind. So if you ignore yourself and say that all that matters is just the collective, I can ignore all of my basic needs, that doesn't make sense either. And I mention that because I feel like in political discussions, but also in spiritual discussions, the pendulum can swing so far in the direction of a pure collectivism, which is part of the picture, just the idea that all that matters is the collective at the expense of the individual. That can be a big problem for setting our individual compasses too, because we have to protect ourselves individually so that we can be of service. If we don't protect ourselves and take care of ourselves, then we can't serve the collective as much, and you need both.
Yeah, that's a really great comment. And, I see it as the middle way, right? In Zen and
Yeah,
Buddhism, they'll kind of talk about that. And looking at which way they swing, and they might swing for in one direction for a period of time, but also having that conscious recognition of it, I've been guilty of that, a lot of my life where I'd focus on the podcast or helping other people or volunteering, or I would do so many calls. And my partner's like, why are you always doing these for free? And I was like, well, they need my help. But meanwhile, after I had my daughter and we needed to provide for the family and things like that, nothing that I did was like kind of business or in a receiving way, right? So having to kind of reorient and think, okay, I'm going to need to do things where I receive a bit, and I can't just only give because all of a sudden you have nothing less. So just kind of analyzing that and balancing the two. But for me, it's like, that intent of how can my work and business and life offer some sort of help to the collective. And that's where prayer and intent, like, God or creator, show me the way to be who I am and contribute to the world, or please guide me and show me a way to live through you, or whatever the case is, whatever, like the Tao or the ether or whatever, this big thing. Like when you go to sleep, your body breathes you what keeps you alive, you could say the functions of each individual thing, right, in your breath, but something is keeping you alive. And when you have near death experiences, which I think I've had like one, two, three, shit, like five or six. Mine were different, where like it was a gun to my head and
whoa,
Mount Everest and almost falling off a cliff a couple of times, you know, stuff like that. Like I know that I'm here until that bigger thing wants to take me home. Right. And I
yeah,
remember the one that I had in Sedona, we got stuck on a cliff face, and I basically had to process my death because I had to get back down, and I'm short, and it was really precarious. And if I fell, I was falling back about 15 feet to a really steep slant, and then I was shooting off. Like there's no way I was stopping. So the likelihood of death was very good. And, myself and my, unfortunately, my partner was trapped too. So we ended up getting down, and it was terrifying because I had to do the leap of faith. There's no way out of the situation. And luckily it was okay. But at that point when I was like, okay, maybe the flash was maybe my work is done. And I was like, huh, that was a really weird thought to have because I didn't choose it. And my partner was like, she wished she had done a lot of different things. And when we were discussing it, and ever since I've been, because you went the university route and
yeah,
all these different things, because you had a map of the world that was shown to you. Luckily for me, I had good parents that said, follow your heart. And I had a strong inclination of who am I? What's my purpose? What am I meant here to do? And I would always ask and journal these questions. And the only distinction between us was I continually asked that and took the leap of faith and did that thing. What's next? What do I want to learn? Who am I really? What's important to me? And going through that value set and then doing the best I can, because it's a continuous evolution. And so, when we're navigating our lives, there's nothing certain. Even if you take the certain path, right, that job might explode. And I've watched my friends go through this, try to take the certain path, right? But they're not looking for the meaningful path or the fulfilling path or the one that's uniquely theirs. And I feel like that's how we honor our life, is becoming fully who we are and having trust and faith in this balance of this greater thing. Because if you fully develop who you are as an individual by your own standards and definitions and values and your uniqueness, that gift is the greatest gift to the collective, right? So like Van Gogh, for example, going through the Van Gogh Museum was amazing. Never made any money in life as an artist. His brother helped him out, all this kind of stuff. But his art inspires for generations to look at the level of mastery possible through art and through, how he was trying to bring the spirit of man into paint. That's timeless. Right. So he's not going up there being like, oh man, really wish I went back and started that art school and, went back to do business and finance. Like he honored the life force, the breath that was within him. So that's a rant. Do you want to comment on that? I'm just getting lost in a
yeah.
tangent.
Well, what you're describing is it's similar to an analogy that I've used in my books. The idea that we're part of a cosmic puzzle, and each of us is a unique puzzle piece, and our task is to embody that puzzle piece as much as we can as an individual, so that we can be part of the collective puzzle. So, like, figuring out what we need to do in our lives to best embody that puzzle piece is critical. And for each of us, it's going to be different. That's why it's so difficult, especially in like looking at different spiritual traditions and spiritual pathways and practices, for each person, it might be that they need it, like there's a different recipe for them. And when people ask me, I'm always I try to be open-minded about it, because what worked for me might not work for someone else. And that might be by design. So it's really trying to figure out where we feel drawn to something, where our passions are, and also where our passions are not. I mean, that's what happened to me in my job. Because we could probably make an argument, Matt, that I could have stayed in my job, that it could have been great financially to keep me on a certain track, and I could do this other stuff on the side, and we probably could have rationally come up with a reason for me to stick in the position. And maybe for some people it was the right thing to do, but for me it was not. And I don't know exactly why, but I was too pulled in another direction. I don't know where it's going to lead me next. I mean, it's led to 2 books, but I don't know what that means or what could be next. So we just really have to listen to ourselves. And I say that now and emphasize it now because we're in a world where there's such a mob mentality of just do this because someone said it's for the common good and it doesn't matter what your individual needs are. That's a very dangerous mentality, where if you had someone who's manipulative at the top coming up with this idea that is good for the collective, that leads to atrocities. And we've seen that with governments throughout the world for a long time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I'm glad that you shared that the cosmic puzzle piece. That's amazing. And when you can come up with analogies that kind of frame these things, that's I feel a demonstration of the understanding. So I think that's a really beautiful analogy. I've kind of taken us on a side note, which I think was helpful. So now we're already at we're at the upside down of liberty, right? And so I just did a law summit. So I think you looking at the podcast, but understanding law. And one of the things that I found out was God created man, and God gave dominion to land, air, and water to man, law. And so under that, man created the government to administer the rights, our property, and all these different things, right? But what happened is corporations and government created corporations. Corporations usurped the government through money and finances and mammon and deception. And then now the government is trying to tell us what we can and can't do, right? And giving us liberty on the land as free beings. Like no one's doing this to squirrels or owls or, raccoons, although we are doing other horrible things with it. But that aside, so, I love the book and I'm going through, your sections here, and I'd love to see if we can address them all. But, how does the government threaten liberty? Government as organized crime, which to me it is, the dangerous psychology and the mind control. So all of these are pieces, and maybe you want to, we'll go by section to section and to kind of discuss what you feel is most relevant.
Sure. Well, the book looks at, sort of like in my first one where I looked at scientific materialism versus, consciousness is fundamental. In this book, in Upside Down Liberty, I'm looking at the principle known as statism versus an alternative, which is sometimes called voluntarism. So I'll just quickly explain what those mean, because I honestly, I didn't know really anything about politics until I started researching this. And I didn't care about politics until the pandemic, because all of a sudden government decisions had a big impact on my life and the lives of other people around us. And governments got to decide whose businesses were essential and whose weren't, and many other things. So all of a sudden we're being micromanaged in a much more obvious way. So I began following very closely, and it led me to look at this fundamental thing. Well, we live under government. What is that? What is government exactly? And statism is the idea that we should live under government. But what does government mean? And there are different definitions for this depending on who you talk to. And a lot of what I did in my book, I referred to the Austrian School of Economics from Ludwig von Mises, M-I-S-E-S, and there's a Mises Institute, which has lots of great videos, M-I-S-E-S. But Murray Rothbard was part of this group, who was a political economist. And the way he defines the state is, I'm paraphrasing here, is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue not through voluntary exchanges, but through coercion, meaning give us your money or you're going to jail. That's not a voluntary exchange. Whereas if let's say you want to go buy an apple at a store, Matt, you can go buy an apple. You can say, I'm going to pay for this. I want this. Whereas, for example, with taxation, it's not like you get to say where you want all your money to go. You don't get to select all the different causes. It goes to this big thing. But so then, well, how is government different than like a typical service provider? Because what is government really? It provides services. There's security, there's legal functions, there's lots of stuff that it does. But like Netflix provides services too. Gyms provide service. There's lots of businesses out there, but government seems to have this special privilege in the way that it provides services. In terms of the way it obtains revenue, it can basically just say this is the tax rate, and you're going to pay it and it's going to go where we want it to go. But we also don't have an explicit contractual relationship in the same way that we would have with a typical service provider. Like what I would see in business, if we had a new client or just anything, any deal that we're working on, there's specific terms about what the service provider is going to deliver. We're going to deliver these things to you, and if we don't, these are the penalties. There can be termination. You can go to something else. With government, we don't have that. We have this more of an implied consent, but it's not laid out in the way that you would expect from other service providers. So we're left in this situation where when you start to evaluate what the government actually is, it's a much more unilateral position than I was trained to think in school, for example. But so this one really got me when I started getting into it. Like the rationale for why we have government is if we didn't have a government, then people are too irrational and stupid and warlike that they would just kill each other and there would be complete chaos. So we can't do it. So what we're going to do to prevent that is we're going to take a subset of those people who are stupid and irresponsible and warlike, and we're going to put them in this position of power. But don't worry about it. We, out of nowhere, we are going to be responsible enough to know which people should be in that position of power, right? So there are lots of these things that they don't add up. And just very quickly, we'll get into this later, I talk about an alternative to this, which is to turn, we can have all the government services, they're important services for society, but make them real service providers in a free market, where if you don't do a good job, guess what? You have financial accountability and people are going to go to a competitor. And that would spawn entrepreneurship and much more liberty, which is voluntarism, where your interactions are voluntary and it's all about non-aggression against private property, which we can get into.
That's amazing. Well, again, I love how you are able to break these things down in a way that is masterful, very important to get right to the root, because the more we understand about the functions and what they do, the more we can kind of pick it apart and then see what works and then disregard what doesn't and then find a solution, which your solution there was very simple and makes sense. And so, well, let's look at a little bit, because there's so much stuff here. You talk about organized crime, which it kind of is, because you're saying it's not voluntary, right? And we have to accept, and we're taught that, right? And even
Right.
when you look at, when I did the law summit with Christopher Gronsky and all these guys, they say if you go into the taxes, they say they are voluntary, but it's under terrible coercion, where if you don't pay them, then you can go to jail forever and we can take your liberty away. And so then it kind of is, but it's not really. And even when you push back on these fines, and what I'm learning about the courts is they're, basically supporting the government as well, and the bar association and the government's all on the same team with the banks, and they're all in this, system where they're not doing a great job with their goods and services. So they're basically coercing their business from us, and we're all getting fleeced more and more from the system, which is kind of a bummer. Talk a little bit about the dangerous psychology or mind control from what you researched.
So the dangerous psychology that I refer to, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is the danger of putting people in positions of power. What that does, it actually can change people. So there's a famous experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment, done in the 1970s, and it hasn't been replicated. There are ethical questions with it. But basically, they had 12 people who were acting as prison guards and 12 people acting as prisoners. And the prison guards became so cruel, they had to end the study early. The power transformed these people. So I mention that because here we are, we're creating a power structure that no matter what, it's going to have revenue. It can do the worst job ever. It's still going to have taxes. If it has a central bank, it can print money out of nowhere. It can create, it will have funds regardless of what it does. And then you have these people who are in positions of power who might actually be, they might be good people to start with, but you can be corrupted. So that's one piece that's important. I also talk about obedience to authority as a way of basically promulgating this evil from a position of power. I talk about Milgram's studies where people are, this was 1970s, so you had two people in the room. One was a paid actor, and the other one was basically asking questions. And the paid actor, if he got it wrong, the other person was supposed to shock him. Okay, but the paid actor would make these like scream in pain as the voltage went higher and higher, even though he wasn't actually being shocked. And the main finding of the study is that the experimenter, the authority figure, would say, "No, you got to keep shocking him. You got that wrong." And the person would do it. They would repeatedly do it because the authority figure said you should do it. That's very important, because that's, you could see in a political structure where you have a few people who are not so good, they could coerce people into just obeying. And then lastly, I talk about psychopaths, which is an important phenomenon to understand, because these are people, this is a psychological phenomenon that's known, who fundamentally do not have empathy. And most of us can't understand what it would be like to be that kind of a person. And because of that, we can't envision the level of evil that someone would be willing to enact. But also, that level of evil loves power for reasons that we can't understand. So you have this like perfect storm where you create this organized criminal enterprise effectively, even though it might do some good things sometimes, but that's structurally, it's not a normal service provider, where you know that people are going to become more, they're going to become worse. Psychology tells us if you put them in a position of power and you've created a magnet for potential psychopaths to have more and more power, and history has shown that dictators will emerge. So the way we have structured it will inherently lead to bad things, which we're seeing now in the world.
That's amazing. Well, it sounds like you figured out the government absolutely perfectly, and are able to describe the why. Man, that's brilliant. So I'd love for you to kind of go, because you go linearly here, which is great. What is the alternative to traditional government, non-aggression, private property rights, free markets, privatizing government functions? When I interviewed Christopher Gronsky for the Law Summit, one of the things that he was suggesting is that you know, the most power comes from your community, right? And then it dwindles the further out you get. And you know, the idea of how people would think that this would work is, or when I thought about it anyways, was like, okay, these are supposed to be public servants, to be, what an honor to serve your community, right? But those people aren't getting elected, and it's like you said, it's we have a kind of broken system fundamentally, where it should be an honor to support your community. You are a public servant, and if you're not doing a good job, you should be removed by your peers. And a lot of us have kind of fallen asleep and just allowed this to happen, and recognize these are public servants that can be held accountable, that we need to kind of switch things up. So do you want to move on to section 2 and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think what you described it's what we're taught in school. It's what the civics books tell us about what a politician should be. And that's probably by design, that the education system is a way to reinforce statism as a benevolent force, that it's this thing that we need in society. We need to have the safety net that's going to be there to protect us. But in reality, the way I think economics shows us is that when you have a competitive market, you're going to have many more corrective mechanisms. But first, I want to talk about like this fundamental principle of non-aggression. And the reason I emphasize that so much is that it aligns with spiritual principles. And that's what I try to do in this book, is I take like these are traditional political and economic ideas we're talking about and combine it with the metaphysics and things like the life review. Non-aggression principle is completely aligned spiritually. The idea is you don't initiate aggression against any person, like their body or their property. So aggression could be physical violence, it could be coercion, extortion, fraud, things like that. But you have a right to defend yourself. If someone,
everything the government does,
everything it does. So Matt, that's my argument. I say if you want to abide by the non-aggression principle, it rules out government by definition, because it only exists because it initiates aggression. It rules out the government as we currently do it. So I agree with you. That's its state of being. So, but if we acted this way, followed the non-aggression principle, then you would have a very diverse voluntary society. Not that it would be perfect. I don't see this happening tomorrow. I'm trying to paint a vision for like what would be ideal. And I'm very clear that it's theoretical because we're in a different place right now. But if it would allow people to have different types of communities. If you'd want to be more by yourself, you could be, because you could just subscribe to whatever services you want to. You could end up having an entity that looks a lot like government, that maybe has the same services, but it's literally you pay as you go, and there could be competitors. It would be much less monopolistic inherently than government is. So I of course, I'm taking a very free market perspective, and in today's world, like the word capitalism, that's such a bad word. And the problem with a lot of these other philosophies out there is that they preach like egalitarian ideals, like we need to help the less privileged, and these are all very important, compassionate ideas, and I understand the impulse behind them, like things like socialism. The problem is that all these philosophies end up encroaching upon people's private property, initiating aggression. It's like if it's more socialistic or communistic. It's, well, we are the entity running society, and therefore we get to allocate where the property goes. You don't get to fully own it, but it's for the good, greater good. We're being compassionate. It's a really like it's a pretty devious type of philosophy when you really think about it, because then you don't fully own you don't own your stuff. And unless you agree to that beforehand, like if you wanted to engage in voluntary socialism, for example, where you agree beforehand as a community, we are going to give up part of our property. That's just part of being a member. If you voluntarily sign up for that, I'm like all for it, because then it's not an invasion of your property. It's what you're voluntarily doing. And that's the distinction I think is often lost, because the government's doing stuff and it's not voluntary. We haven't explicitly agreed to all the stuff. It's like an implicit agreement, and our private property rights are going away. And that can include our money. We don't have rights to what we own.
Those are really great points, and it reminds me of Klaus Schwab and his whole slogan of "You will own nothing and be happy." And when you look at these people and their books and their writings coming from the World Economic Forum and all these people with absolutely immense influence, if you were a billionaire, what you could do, what I could do as a billionaire, even to, let's say, one province in Canada, I could buy up so much land. There's so much influence I could have with that wealth. And I feel like that's what's happening here is we have these people that have immense wealth, and people aren't understanding the power they wield with that. And I had one friend who is a multimillionaire, and he has a friend who's a billionaire, and he was talking to his friend who's a billionaire, and he said, what's the difference between a multimillionaire and a billionaire? And his friend told him that when you make $1 billion, you better bring your harpoon gun. And I was like, what does that mean? Basically saying like, this is a whole nother world, right? You start to play in real worlds of influence here. And so this is something that a smaller community might need to correct if that institution or that agenda or that intention doesn't have your good in mind, right? And then but it's really connecting to the government these days, right, with lobbying and how you could buy someone out. And when you look at the Confessions of an Economic Hitman and what they're able to do in poorer countries, I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it's kind of what they've done. When I was looking at why we had war and starvation, well, I'm like, well, what do they have starvation for? Well, it turns out if you keep a country poor, real easy to take their resources. Then you put somebody in power that says, you know what, we want to have a great community here and we want to get a strong middle class and all this and that. Well, if that guy starts doing that, you can just shoot him in the face, or you can bribe him. Well, bribe him first, but if that doesn't work, then you can shoot him in the face after. And we've had a lot of assassinations this last bunch of years, and there's been assassinations in the health community as well. So this isn't a I'm kind of getting off a tangent, but have you heard of the work of Michael Tellinger and the Ubuntu movement?
I've heard of his work. I don't know too much about that movement though.
Okay, so it's not the same of what you're suggesting. It is the idea of how to grow a community where everybody benefits, right? And what we're talking about are these frameworks. And what you're coming up here with is I think really good, and I want to continue on with it. But just to say that you're looking at the best worldview, because right now our politics is left versus right. But if you've got somebody on top, if I own both Coke and Pepsi, if I own both McDonald's and Burger King, and I'm not giving you an actual solution that's going to give you energy and vibrance, it's not that helpful. We need to look at the root of it, and we also need to test these things. So the Ubuntu framework, I think, is powerful, and I think what you're suggesting here is also powerful and actually doable. And so you can either comment on my rant there, or I'd love to move into the metaphysics related to politics and economics.
Yeah, I'll comment on a few things. You made some really good points. So with regard, I don't know the specifics of the Ubuntu movement that he's working on, but I think with the framework that I'm discussing here, known as voluntarism, you could have different types of communities that can try different things. So I think there's compatibility even without knowing exactly what he's up to, because if people are voluntarily want to try a community like that, I'm saying go for it. And maybe since we're all different puzzle pieces, there are different types of communities that are going to be best for each of us. We don't know what those are going to be like. So I love that general idea. As long as people are not initiating aggression, that's the key, which is what our government inherently does. But also I wanted to address this idea of like wealthy individuals and corporations. I think all of those things can be huge problems. And the argument that I make is that those problems are compounded when you have the structure of the state as we do it now. that the state becomes a vehicle for corporations and wealthy individuals to enact power over many, many people, because they can effectively, with a law change that they can fund, we're seeing it all over the world now. You can lock down a whole country. So one of the counter, I mentioned this because some people will say, well, Mark, there's no actual government. Even if you have the same services, then you're not going to have like someone watching over it, and these corporations are so evil. So to me, like someone becoming rich or a corporation doing really well is not inherently evil, because if they're doing it through voluntary exchanges, it means they're providing a good or a service that someone is willingly paying for, and they deserve to be compensated for that. So as long as there's no coercion involved, there's nothing like spiritually wrong with it. And there's this like such negativity against anyone who's wealthy or any corporation. It's like they're automatically evil. It's possible that some of them are, but I think there needs to be a recontextualization, because if you're there needs to be incentives for people to provide goods and services in a really positive way. Government doesn't have that incentive because the government's going to exist no matter what. And in a free market, you have incentives, and that spawns innovation. And I saw this firsthand in my profession, that when you have lots of people competing against each other, that can lead to positive things. When you take away competitive dynamics, it actually is going to take away from the way society can grow.
Well, man, yeah, I love that. And I agree. And the way that you stated it there, again, it goes back to exactly what's going on right now, the state becoming a vehicle for corporations. Or when I gave the framework of law, creator gave the rights to man, man created government, government created corporations. While you look now, you have these corporations mandating and coercing a product. Right. And then
Right.
and that's trying to take over our free will, whether we want the product or not, whether it's a good product or not. If we don't want it, and they're mandating and coercing, use every tactic possible so that we must take this product in a way that is very coercive, then that's probably not ideal. And that's the issue we're having. So what you're suggesting in your framework is a way to prevent that, but also at the same time, like you said, recontextualizing what wealth is. Because if it's a different system, like what is it, Patagonia, you know what I mean, doing good business the right
Yeah.
way, they were going to go out of business, but they made the right moves, and now their business is thriving. That's good, everybody is down with that. The problem is when you get so big and these companies have so much power, they start to do coercive and manipulative things, to then harm others, or to block out the market, or to prevent anybody else from growing. And so it needs to be finding. So what do you find the solution to that being, like a Walmart not taking over, or these big corporations not, because if it's voluntary and you're harming yourself, I guess that's okay. But it's probably not going to happen without coercion or manipulation or some other factor involved with that.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's impossible to know exactly how things will play out, but the theoretical idea is that if companies start doing bad stuff to their employees, then the people aren't going to want to work there as much, and people might start boycotting the product. So in a free market, you could have competitors that emerge. If it's actually a free market, if you don't have a government that's getting involved in making the rules. The problem with government making the rules is that, to quote PJ O'Rourke, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, when buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. So all you have to do is buy the politicians and you can change the business landscape. But if you don't have that dynamic, it's truly a free market, and you start doing bad stuff as an employer, then that would be an incentive for other employers to say, no, we're going to treat our employees well. And then that company, the one that's doing bad stuff, they're going to lose employees. So to me, like the free market will balance things out theoretically.
Yeah, I think so too. And it makes me think about diversity, right? Because if you only have one choice, that takes away freedom, right? That's what they want to
Yeah.
do with communism, or, a simple thing like which gym I want to go to. Like, Canada gave, I don't know, whatever bailout to Good Life Gym. So what if there's only one gym I need to go to in order to get to that gym? I have to go through these hoops. There's no diversity, there's no free market, and there's no choice. There's no vote with your time and with your energy. And then the market can adapt to what the people want. And usually what people want is evolution. What people want is freedom, is growth. And you're going to be catering to those things. I feel like the negative side of humanity, where we're wanting these things that might not be so great, they come from trauma, misdirection, unfulfillment, and also a lot of coercion, right? You look at TV, and I did a lot of study on psychological operations and propaganda and things like that, and just to see the influence of movies, the influence of media and shows and what it's portraying. It's not doing it in a way that is um, inspiring positive change within the individual and how they navigate this world, and how they, again, the worldview and the framework. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the metaphysics, and how that relates to politics and economics. Right there at that chapter, all the people going through like, oh god, oh no, 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 I can't, why are you even saying metaphysics? But I'm sure you're gonna be able to frame it in a way whether if they're a little bit open-minded, they're gonna get some value from it.
Yeah, well, when I say metaphysics, I'm talking about this idea, one mind, one consciousness, the reality of psychic phenomena, the reality that consciousness continues after the death of the body. So what I'm trying to do is to say, well, like for my second book, I said, well, how should we live life? How should we orient our compass and set an overall intention if we accept that we live as part of one consciousness, or whirlpools within a stream? The same question exists for how we should structure society optimally. If that's true metaphysically, that we're all interconnected and we're having this experience, we have amnesia and don't remember all of it, then how should we structure society? And to me, it comes down to this non-aggression principle. We can't have it. We can't have an optimally metaphysically aligned society if the basis of the way everything's structured is predicated upon aggression against people's private property. To have a few people who get to say, no, we're smart, we know that society should be structured this way, and we're going to inject our opinion here in the economy and here, and we're going to do this kind of stimulus because we know it's best for everyone. It's impossible. No matter how smart or well-intentioned people are, if they're doing things that are not without the consent of every individual, they're going to be biasing the entire economy and the entire society based upon what they think is best. And to me, from a spiritual perspective, it's a spiritual arrogance, because we don't know. How could you even know? How could you know if a certain stimulus package is going to be the best for every single person, especially if some people don't want that stimulus package? Really, it's what a few people think is the best and their theory. So like that's how I look at everything now, is through this non-aggression principle, which to me is ultimately liberty. If people are not infringing upon your body or your private property, then you are free. And as long as you're not doing that, then you have an opportunity to be out there in the world and not always succeed. So part of what we're here to do, I think, is to evolve. And that means making mistakes. And that means taking risks sometimes, and taking risk on your own accord. And what we're seeing now is that basically a few people are deciding, no, this is the risk that everyone's going to take. We're going to determine your risk preferences for you. You can't leave your house because we have determined that that's not okay, rather than letting people and businesses decide those things for themselves. Because metaphysically, to me, that's very much improper. It's in many ways evil to not allow a person to take their own risk.
Yeah, man. Again, I love all that, and I think that you've nailed it. One of the quotes that's been very helpful for me for the last couple of years in wanting to do good and say, okay, there's two points of view. How do I know if I'm doing something that's positive or that's right, or I'm on, everyone thinks they're on the right side, right? Like, oh, and you have this divide, and I feel like there's a clear answer to what the right and good side is. However, this quote is the one that really helped me understand that. And it says, anything that seeks to restrict or bind by definition is Luciferian. And that again was from Rudolf Steiner. And so what I'm doing, and if this is a free will universe, or what I'm, doing and navigating my life, I'm not trying to take your freedom of choice away, right? If you are so afraid of what's going on right now, you can stay at home. You can wear a hazmat suit. You can wear 9 hazmat suits. But if and you can make the argument, well, me just living my life and I'm killing everybody. If you can show me good proof for that, then I will change my view. But until then, you're going to have to I don't know, manage your own fears, right? So if you're afraid of that, then you can wear that hazmat suit. But I can't stay at home forever based on what your view is, right? But I can respect you. I could, when we're in the same space, I can give you respect and honor and dignity and all those different things within reason. Right. But if you want to dictate my whole entire existence and you want to restrict and bind me based on your beliefs that, you should be able to at least present a good argument for, right? Because if you could say that, if you come over to my house and say, Matt, turns out you're the most deadly man in the whole world, and every time you go out, you murder 1,000 people, I'll be like, oh shit, no way. And so, and so if you show me good proof that I'm like, damn, like that's true. I'm like, okay, how am I going to mitigate that? Because I'm a good and honorable person. Right. But what people are doing, you know, is restricting and binding people's movement, their freedom of speech, the way that they live, their businesses. And so it should be up to them, you know, those choices. And if people want to go into that business or not go into that business, that's up to them. They also get to exercise that free will choice. So I feel like that quote was very helpful for me. Just understand, I want to empower people. I want to give them more freedom. I want to give them more power, you know, in all the ways that I can, right? And not restrict or bind in any way. And to me, that's that comes with risk, just like snowboarding. You know, it's risky just to strap on a snowboard and go down a big huge mountain. It's a risk to do a backflip. It's a risk to do, you know, a 70-foot jump. But I get to manage that risk with my ability, my free will, my intent, and my experience for life. It's a risk to go on a plane, to even go meditate and be in a foreign country and all the stuff you don't know what's going on there. What if you get robbed? What if you get killed? Right? You get to manage that risk to enjoy our planet, to see the things, to maybe eat food that makes you sick. It happens, but you know, you want to go and you want to explore that and make that choice for yourself. So that's my rant. You want to add on to it?
Yeah. Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about like the way certain businesses will have different rules, especially with regard to everything that's happening right now. And the way I look at that is a private business can do what it wants. The problem is when the government comes in and tells the businesses what they have to do, even if they don't want to. So it's like you on your private property, you can have your rules and someone can voluntarily agree or not agree to engage with that private property. So let's say there's a store that mandates something that you don't want, then you don't go into that store. And then the business is going to have to deal with the consequences of that it might lose business of people that aren't going to come into their store anymore because of their rules. So I'm all for like letting businesses do what they want to do as long as they're not initiating aggression, but they can have their rules. Private property owners can have their rules and the market will organize itself. Where if people think those are crazy rules or something horrible, then they're going to go in a different direction.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it's a great way to, um, you know, let people decide for themselves, right? Let people, right? Because with everything that's going on now, right? If you're worried, well, you could have a certain restaurant that's so safe and you are in a cubicle that's air ventilated and all that kind of stuff, then that could be your choice and you can choose that. Or if you're a little bit of a risky guy, you could go out like in Canada, we're just like locked down the whole way, right? But you go down to Texas and people are just going outside like it's no business. You know, they're getting on sports events, they're probably hugging and high-fiving. You know, I'm a risky guy. I might want to take that risk. You know, I don't want the government telling me I got to stay at home again and don't go outside because somehow it's worse here. It's you know, it's taking my freedom away. So we can navigate. And that's what's happening now with these mass exodus of these different states and people are moving to and making their choice with how they live and where they're going to go within the states of the United States. But not every other country has that option. So they've kind of got to figure it out within their system. And that's a testament to the United States and the system you have to have these checks and balances that still will provide a little bit of freedom. Where in Canada, the way our government works is once Trudy kind of makes one blanket, and I always call him Trudy now. Once my buddy did, I was like, that's hilarious. That's all I'm going to call him. Makes a blanket statement. We all get that, right? Our provinces don't really exercise the same amount of freedom that you guys get to in the States. And so that's why I'm confident that, you know, when I look from the war perspective and all the things that I've seen, they always talked about the United States as this home for freedom. And now I'm understanding that more and more and how that government system set up. So now when we take the old and we institute some of these new ideas, so what's happening now is corrected and doesn't happen again. This is how we really improve upon a system. So with your last section here, you talk about the path to true liberty. And I'd love for you to finish with a few comments on that.
Sure. Well, the way I describe it in simple terms is that we need to spiritualize our lives and get the government out of our lives. Those are the two basic steps. And the term that I use in the book, I use the term non-dual, which just means one consciousness. It's used in a lot of spiritual traditions. So I call it non-dual voluntarism. Voluntarism is this voluntary society. So basically what I've tried to do is create what I'm calling a metaphysical political framework, because you could be you could be completely anti-spiritual and still want to be in a voluntary society, which just means you're going to have a different outlook in life. And I think it would be more prone to potential corruption because you're not going to have that spiritual sense of natural law and like the life review and that sort of thing. But my point is that there's most of political theory is regarded on just of like either you're right or left, or you want some version of a state, or you want a completely stateless society, and that's it. To me, it's you need that, but then you also need the metaphysical part of it, and where do people fall on that spectrum. So I think as we're moving forward and looking at how should we ideally structure this new earth that we seem to be moving into, and I hope we're gonna get there in a positive way. It will need to be one that's much more spiritual, that we're aware of our spiritual nature, and where government, as we have structured it currently, needs to go away. We need to have many more of our liberties, even if in the interim it means that governments have fewer ways of initiating aggression. That's the way we have to move, at least in my opinion.
Well, I definitely agree, and I like how you have kind of combined so many important elements to provide a framework that makes logical sense and also spiritual sense. In the Eastern cultures, they talk about yin yang or masculine, feminine. Logical, emotional, or creative. We need both of these in play to have a holistic system, right? And then and look at some of these principles, and like we've talked about, these frameworks or these world views or political views, right? Is like, well, if you want to sign up for a view that's authoritarianism and one person gets to dictate everything, you're welcome to do that, but maybe try it in this small spot where everyone else who wants that can go over there. You want to try something else that gives people the option to move over here, and people can vote with their time and their energy. And as we do that, this will allow for natural selection in the way that the systems that are more aligned to natural law, to harmony, to quality of life, to freedom, to fulfillment, to prosperity, to kindness, compassion, and all the beautiful attributes of what it is to be human, those systems are going to grow and evolve, and people will want to participate in them. And what's happening, I think, right now is globally, we have the opposite of that, right? And it's becoming more and more instructing, more and more binding, and a solution needs to be had because, it's just becoming too much for those who don't align with those principles to bear. And I feel like that's what the great opportunity is a realignment, a reimagining, a reparticipation. And government is participation, right? We can hold our politicians accountable. We as the community can create something new and better immediately, and all that takes is a little bit of cooperation, right? It's like, no, we're not going to do that. So who's going to enforce it? Nobody's going to enforce it. Okay, it all, because it's all people wearing different costumes, right? And claiming authority, which really doesn't exist at the end of the day. It's
Yeah.
mostly people, right? So people deciding amongst themselves what's most important, and what they want to vote for, what they find valuable, and then working towards that as a community. um yeah, so you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think to sum it up, what we've both been alluding to is a shift in consciousness, that if we all start to become aware of what it really means for us to be free and spiritual beings, then I think it opens things up. We don't know how that's even going to manifest metaphysically. Like what happens when someone shifts their consciousness and realizes, wait a second, I'm not completely free. I'm under somewhat of a dictatorship, even though I've been told I'm free. I really don't have rights to all my private property, and taxation is pretty coercive. Just having that mental shift in our own mind, I think will make us less tolerant of where we're being stepped on. And who knows what a critical mass would be. But that's why I have these conversations like I'm having with you, and write books. And because you don't, to me, it's all about a shift in consciousness, especially if all of reality is just consciousness and we're all whirlpools within the stream. It's like, how many of these whirlpools do you need to shift their compass in a different direction where we could have a world where there isn't so much corruption and there's much more liberty?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that what you've written out here as a framework is brilliant, and the invitation to analyze the worldview, that's the big thing to begin with, right? We don't take stock of the worldviews we hold on anything. And when we do that and we look at the systems in place, you really uncover some things often that are not in alignment with your values or the way that you would see them going. And unfortunately, it's kind of sad, right? It's just like, oh man, that's not what I thought it was. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. That's not what I thought it was. It's a lot different. And so if we can take the time to assess our systems, reimagine them, and then once we build something that or create a new framework, we can go try and build it. We can improve upon it, but the idea is going to be our participation and our free will choice, not creating reality by default where, oh, the government's just going to do this or my reality is this, so that's what I'm going to do. It's no, let's consciously engage in this. Let's figure out what's the best for everybody in the holistic sense, but it doesn't take away. We have all these other basic principles, right? You can't go harm someone. You can't, go take their property. And then how do we work together? Because people are going to want to volunteer and work together in a framework like that. So this has been really wonderful, man. Where can people find more about you and get your book, which I would invite people to get and put on all the coffee tables for every American possible? Hopefully this will bridge the gap for both sides. I know it seems to me that there's a certain groups of people are becoming more and more defensive and they don't want to discuss anything, and I feel like that's always a dangerous ideology and philosophy, because it is the debate and the conversation and the respect of one another that allows for truth and solutions to arise. And we want to honor the higher truth. The pursuit of truth, doesn't it's an evolution. It's not a finite thing, right? It can continuously evolve. And so I feel like that's really important. And maybe this book will give a lot of people, the opportunity to open their mind a little bit to say, okay, maybe we can improve this thing a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's my hope. Thank you, Matt. I write books and I never know who's going to read them or what impact it's going to have, but I'm trying to put the ideas out there. So my books all of them are available on Amazon. You can hear me, Matt?
There you go. Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Sorry, cut out for a second. My books are available on Amazon. First one's called An End Upside Down Thinking, then An End Upside Down Living, and the most recent one, An End Upside Down Liberty. My podcast called Where Is My Mind is on all the major podcast players, Apple, Spotify, everywhere else. And my website is my name, MarkGober.com, markgober.com, and that's where you can find out more.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. I'm so glad that you've written this book. I think it's going to help a lot of people. I think it invites at least the invitation to looking at the worldview of how our structures work. And oh, you can't hear me now. Okay. Can you hear me? No. Okay, you're gonna have to. Mark can't hear me, but I'm gonna close it out. Thanks so much, Mark, for coming. I appreciate you guys. Check out his book. Check out his work. He's a phenomenal guy. So buy the book for a friend. This is a great book to send your political buddy. So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.